Washington. A former militia leader from Libya was convicted on Tuesday of terrorism charges arising from the 2012 attacks in Benghazi, Libya, that killed a United States ambassador and 3 other Americans. But he was acquitted of multiple counts of the most serious offense, murder. The defendant, Ahmed Abu Khattala, 46, was the first person charged and successfully prosecuted in the attacks, which took on broader significance as Republicans and conservative news outlets sought to use them to damage the presidential ambitions of Hillary Clinton, who was then the Secretary of State. But the 7-week trial in federal court in Washington received relatively little attention from such quarters. Mr. Khattala was convicted on 4 counts, including providing material support for terrorism, destroying property and placing lives in jeopardy at the mission, and brandishing a firearm during a crime of violence, but acquitted on 14 others. He faces up to 60 years in prison for the 4 convictions. The mixed verdict showed the difficulty of prosecuting terrorism cases when the evidence is not clear-cut. The outcome was reminiscent of the 2010 federal trial of Ahmed Khalfan Gailani, a Tanzanian man and former Guantanamo Bay detainee who was charged in federal court as a conspirator in the 1998 bombings of 2 American embassies in East Africa that killed hundreds. Mr. Gailani was acquitted of most of the charges, including each murder count for those who died, but convicted of 1 count of conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. Mr. Khattala's attorney, Michelle Peterson, declined to comment after the verdict was announced. The trial included dramatic testimony from State Department and CIA operatives who fought desperately to prevent militants from killing more Americans stationed in Benghazi. On the night of the attacks, armed men overran the diplomatic compound and set fire to it. Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens and another State Department employee, Sean Smith, were killed. Hours later, militants attacked the nearby CIA base with mortars and small arms fire. 2 CIA security contractors, Tyrone S. Woods and Glenn A. Doherty, were killed, and others were wounded. The unusual circumstances of the crime and the evidence an orchestrated, military-style assault in a near-failed state were a challenge for federal investigators and prosecutors. The government showed the jury large amounts of surveillance video from the attacks, but Mr. Khattala did not show up inside the diplomatic compound until the fighting was over. Prosecutors acknowledged that there was no evidence that Mr. Khattala had personally fired any shots or set any fires, but argued that he had nevertheless helped orchestrate the attacks and aided them while they were underway. To make that case, they drew primarily on testimony from 3 Libyan witnesses and on a database said to be Mr. Khattala's cell phone records, which it had obtained from Libya. The government argued to the jury that several of the main attackers worked for Mr. Khattala in his militia. The prosecutor, Michael DiLorenzo, called them part of his hit squad in closing arguments last week and pointed to phone records showing that he had been in contact with them throughout the events.